All right, gentlemen, we are now going to continue with Chapter 5, and we're now looking at the second section of this chapter, which deals with the cycling of matter. Again, this is all in terms of and within the aspects of an ecosystem. And so we're going to look at several different cycles. We're really looking at this conceptually again. But you're going to want to be familiar with these cycles and how they work. This is a little bit more of a, if I could say, science-y kind of chapter that we have, or at least section of a chapter. So we have a list here of the different things we're going to be talking about. And that list continues on this slide. Don't worry about this. The objective questions, again, you don't want to only be familiar with these, but you want to be able to answer these. Being able to answer these not only prepares you for the oral quiz, but it shows that you are starting to grasp the concepts that are within the chapter. All right, the first cycle that we look at in terms of an ecosystem is the carbon cycle. And right off the bat, guys, I think it's important that we recognize and we understand that these are called cycles. Okay, so this is going to be about how these materials not only leave a particular ecosystem, but then how they re-enter into that particular ecosystem. And that is generally what we're looking at. And the first material, which is very, very important to all ecosystems, and all of these is carbon. And by definition, the carbon cycle is the movement of carbon from the non-living environment into living things and then back to the environment. Again, it's a cycle, so it's back and forth. Carbon is absolutely essential. So living organisms need carbon to make proteins. They need carbon to make fats. They need carbon to make carbohydrates. All of those larger, if you will, macromolecules are needed for all organisms. Not just one or the other, but they're all needed for all organisms. In fact, carbon ends up being so important that we actually have a branch of chemistry called organic chemistry that's basically based on the study of carbon-containing organisms. That's a bit of a simplification, but there is really truth to that. That's what this is all about. This diagram here shows us, and it's in your textbook. It shows us the carbon cycle diagrammatically, and you can see that these cycles are not simple cycles. There is a level of complexity. There are multiple vehicles for entry and exit within different parts of the ecosystem for entry and exit of the carbon. So we talk about carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere, and respiration will put it into the atmosphere. Combustion will put it into the atmosphere. But then we can have carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere that goes into other things. So we have photosynthesis that's going to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And then we see where there's decomposition and erosion. CO2 can dissolve in and out of the water from the atmosphere as things decompose. Natural gas, oil and coal can lead to the release of carbon dioxide as they're burned. So you can see this is a fairly complex system. We know that carbon is in the air, it's in water, it's in living organisms. We know, as we learned, that producers, part of their process of producing is going to be converting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, in the atmosphere into carbohydrates during photosynthesis. And then we know that consumers, again, this is just what we learned in the first section, they're going to get their carbon from carbohydrates in the producers they eat. And of course, consumers eat other consumers as well. Cellular respiration plays a big role in the carbon cycle, and we've learned about cellular respiration already because cellular respiration is the process whereby some of the carbon is released back into the atmosphere, in particular as carbon dioxide. You as an animal, as your cells carry out the process of cellular respiration, they're giving off carbon dioxide as a waste product, and when you exhale, exhaling is part of your body's physiological means to get rid of or release that carbon dioxide. And then as carbon goes out into the environment, there's places within the ecosystem that can be stored. Limestone is a storage vehicle for carbon, and we call that a carbon sink. And limestone is one of the largest carbon sinks on the earth because wherever there is limestone, and there is quite a bit of limestone, there is a considerable amount of carbon that is stored within the limestone. We also know that carbon is stored within the bodies of organisms. When you exhale, you're not breathing out all of the carbon in the form of carbon dioxide. There is carbon within fat within your body. There is carbon within oils. There are other molecules that have carbon in it. When an organism dies, that carbon is ultimately released back into the cycle, put back into the environment through the process of decomposition. And ultimately, they can become part of coal deposits, they can become part of oil, natural gas, and those are fossil fuels. And we call them fossil fuels because they come from dead organic material. And those fossil fuels are actually storing carbon that's left from the bodies of organisms that died in the past. Now, we can have an effect on the carbon cycle. Certainly, we recognize that our activities and activities of other animals, this is not a closed system, so to speak. So we burn fossil fuels. It's going to release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It's going to release carbon that has been stored and trapped. It's going to break it out and let it go back into the system. And here again, this idea that increased levels of carbon dioxide contribute to climate change. We saw the video. That's at least one scientific theory. It's just important, I think, for you guys to know it's not the only scientific theory out there. So keep that in mind. We do know that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. We've already learned that, but it's not the only greenhouse gas. Water vapor, and in fact, a lot of the scientists we saw in the video would say that water vapor is the most important greenhouse gas, not carbon dioxide. And we know how the greenhouse gases work to affect the temperature and really help the planet maintain a climate that is habitable. The next cycle we talk about is the nitrogen cycle. And nitrogen, again, is a very important component. This cycle is a process in which nitrogen circulates, in particular among air, soil, water, plants, and animals within any given ecosystem. It's constantly in flux, it's constantly moving. And nitrogen, again, is important to all organisms. Nitrogen is needed to build proteins in particular, and proteins are needed to build new cells. So nitrogen has a little bit more of specificity, I guess we could say, than the carbon, in particular nitrogen. You want to think proteins. And nitrogen is very, very abundant. Remember, as an atmospheric gas, it makes up 78% of the atmosphere. So it's a very, very abundant element, very, very abundant material. So what happens? Well, the first thing we need to think about in terms of nitrogen is that the form that it is in the atmosphere as an atmospheric gas is not usable by organisms. So in order for the organisms, technically, even if you think about us, we breathe in nitrogen as we breathe in the atmosphere, but it's completely unusable. And so something needs to be done to it, and we call that fixing it. The nitrogen needs to be fixed before organisms can use it. And how nitrogen fixing takes place is through certain bacteria, and really only a small number of bacteria. We actually call them nitrogen fixing bacteria. And what these bacteria have the ability to do is take gaseous atmospheric nitrogen and then put it into or convert it into other compounds that contain nitrogen but can actually be used by organisms as they get into the organisms, in particular as they get ingested into the organisms. And as I said, those bacteria are known as nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And so the nitrogen-fixing bacteria convert the atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia. And as weird as it sounds, ammonia then is a step toward being in a format, so to speak, that organisms can actually use. And where these bacteria are found are actually within nodules of certain kinds of plants. There's these nodes or these bumps on the roots, and the particular plants that we're talking about are called legumes. Legumes would be beans, peas, clover, that family of plants. Peanuts, for example, are a very common legume in the South. And if you've ever pulled a peanut plant out of the ground, if you look at the roots, there's these little nodules on the roots, and those nodules contain the bacteria. And that's why also in terms of agriculture, you can plant these types of plants in fields that need to go fallow or rest for a time, and it will help increase the nitrogen in the soil where they're located. And then what the bacteria do is they use the sugar provided by the plant, by the legume, and produce nitrogen-containing compounds such as nitrates. This should sound familiar to you guys because this is so important to plant development that nitrates is one of the things we actually test in the soil analysis report. And then excess nitrogen is fixed by the bacteria and then released into the soil. So the soil actually gains from this process as well. As we continue to look at this, we see that we have here another diagram that shows, again, multiple different avenues. We have atmospheric nitrogen, and you see down by the deer, there's nitrogen-fixing bacteria in soil. Root nodules produce ammonia. Other bacteria convert ammonia into nitrates, which the plants can use. Bacteria in soil and water add nitrogen to the atmosphere by giving it off. There's aquatic bacteria that produces nitrogen. There's runoff that brings nitrogen into bodies of water. And then interestingly, lightning converts atmospheric nitrogen into nitrates that organisms can use. But again, multiple entry and exit points within the cycle. Decomposers are also very important to the nitrogen cycle in particular. Nitrogen is stored within the bodies of living things, just like we talked about carbon, and it's returned to the nitrogen cycle once the organisms die. And then decomposers have a very, very important role to play then, guys. They break down decaying plants, they break down dead animals, and they break down animal wastes and plant wastes. And that breaking down, that decomposition will actually return nitrogen to the soil, and bacteria will transform some of that into nitrogenous gas. That goes back into the atmosphere, and this is just the nitrogen cycle going and going. The next one is the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is an important element, part of a lot of molecules that make up cells of all living organisms. And plants get phosphorus generally from soil and water, and animals generally get phosphorus by eating plants and eating other animals. So these things are in the things that organisms consume, so to speak, and that's how the organisms get what they need. And the phosphorus cycle is defined as the cyclical movement of phosphorus from environment to organism and then back to the environment. You see the definition for each one of these is the same, but the mechanism may be slightly different. This diagram shows the phosphorus cycle slightly different. There's phosphate within rocks, and that weathering and then erosion can bring the phosphate into bodies of water, decomposition of plants and animals, phosphate in the soil, phosphate into water, rocks, fish, runoff, leaching, fertilizer. All of this is in terms of the phosphorus cycle. And so we see that phosphorus enters soil and water when rocks erode. Small amounts of phosphorus dissolve as phosphate, which moves into soil, water, and groundwater. And then plants absorb the phosphates in the soil through the roots. I want you guys to see again, this should have at least some familiarity to us as we look at the fact that our soil analysis included looking at the amount of phosphorus in the soil. So plants need these things, and plants in particular need phosphorus. Phosphorus can wash off the land and end up in bodies of water. This can be through fertilizer and other components as well. And then we have phosphate salts, which are not soluble in water. And what happens with those, if they run into bodies of water, they actually will sink as part of the sediment and accumulate at the bottom. We can talk about nitrogen and phosphorus in terms of fertilizer and their cycles. Fertilizers, whether it's Miracle-Gro, whether it's commercial grade for large-scale farming, chemical fertilizers are used to cause plants to grow faster and better. And nitrogen and phosphorus are so important to plant growth that all these fertilizers are always going to contain both nitrogen and phosphorus. But what happens is, generally what we tend to do is we use excessive amounts. We use more than we need because we don't take the time to figure out how much we need, and it creates runoff because it doesn't all get used by the plants, and it can get into terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems because of this process of runoff. And it can cause rapid growth of algae. We've already talked about algal blooms before, but if we think of the algae just like the plants that people are trying to get to grow better on land, well, when the algae get a hold of this excess nitrogen and phosphorus, they're going to take off and they're going to have an explosive growth as well. And what does that do? Well, we've talked about this. Depletes the aquatic ecosystem, uses up oxygen, especially in decomposition, and causes fish and other organisms to ultimately die.